God bless you. Welcome to 15 minutes of overflowing grace. Today I will be teaching on what I titled The Grace of Giving. Our text is taken from 2 Corinthians chapter 8 from verse 1 to 5. I will be reading from International Standard Version of the Bible. It says, "We want you to know, brothers, about God's grace that was given to the churches of Macedonia." Verse 2, "In spite of their terrible ordeal of suffering, their abundant joy and deep poverty have led them to be abundantly generous. I can testify that by their own free will, they have given to the utmost of their ability, yes, even beyond their ability." Verse 4, "And they begged us earnestly for the privilege of participating in this ministry to the saints." Verse 5, "And we did not expect that. They gave themselves to the Lord first, and then to us, since this was God's will." What is grace of giving? What is the grace of giving? First and foremost, let's define the word grace. Grace is divine influence upon the heart that enables one to be and to do that which ordinarily one could not be or do before. The grace of giving is the divine influence upon the heart that enables one to give that which ordinarily one cannot give. I say that again. The grace of giving is the divine influence upon the heart that enables one to give that which ordinarily one cannot give. The grace of giving is the divine influence upon the heart that makes or enables one to be generous and to give beyond one's ability. Let's look at that 2 Corinthians chapter 8 from verse 1 to 5 again. "I want you to know, brothers, about God's grace that was given to the churches of Macedonia. In spite of their terrible ordeal of suffering, their abundant joy and deep poverty have led them to be abundantly generous." Verse 3, "I can testify that by their own free will, they have given to the utmost of their ability, yes, even beyond their ability." Verse 4, "They begged us earnestly for the privilege of participating in this ministry to the saints." Verse 5, "We did not expect that. They gave themselves to the Lord first, and then to us, since this was God's will." Take note of the following. There was a grace that was given to the churches of Macedonia. This shows that grace is a divine gift. It is not of works. Grace is given, and because it is given, it must be received by faith. Grace is not of works. You don't work for grace, you receive grace. The churches in Macedonia receive this grace that was given to them by God. Look at the condition of these churches. They were in terrible ordeal of suffering. They were in deep poverty. They were not just poor, they were in deep poverty. Yet they had abundance of joy. Yet they had an abundance of joy. People that were in deep poverty, yet they had abundance of joy. Therefore, joy is not a function of one's physical state or financial state. Joy does not depend on your physical or financial state. If it depends on any of these things, the Macedonian church or churches will not have abundance of joy. Joy is a quality of the spirit. Joy is different from happiness. Happiness depends on happenings. But joy is a quality of the spirit. The Macedonian churches were in terrible ordeal of suffering. They were in deep poverty, yet they had abundance of joy. In spite of their terrible ordeal of suffering and deep poverty, The grace that was given to them led them to be abundantly generous. Therefore, being abundantly generous has nothing to do with being abundantly rich and wealthy, or being poor, wretched, busted, and disgusted. You can be rich and wealthy, yet not be generous. And you can be in deep poverty and yet not be generous. You can be in deep poverty, yet be highly generous. You can be rich and wealthy and still be highly generous. This is what I'm saying in essence. Being generous is a function of grace. It is not a matter of one's financial status or physical well-being. It is a matter of activating the grace of God. The grace of giving is all about being generous. It has nothing to do with your financial status. Generosity or being generous has nothing to do with one's financial status. Rather, it has everything to do with the grace of God. Every believer has received the overflowing grace or the fullness of his grace the day he or she received Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior. This is because Jesus is the fullness or all the graces of God. John chapter 1 verse 16 to 17 says, we have all received one gracious gift after another from his abundance. Because while the law was given through Moses, grace and truth came through Jesus the Messiah. Let me read from King James. John chapter 1 verse 16 to 17. And of his fullness have all we received, grace for grace. For the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ. You can see, as a child of God, you have received the fullness of God's grace. The fullness of God's grace, including the grace of giving. Therefore, every child of God ought to be generous, because we have received the fullness of God's grace. We ought to be generous, highly generous. Look at the church of the Macedonian, the churches in Macedonia. They were in deep poverty. They were in trouble. They were stressed out. They were in great ordeal of suffering. Yet their abundance of joy spilled over to generosity. Can you see that? That is not your financial status that determines your generosity. You can be rich and still be very stingy. You can be poor and still be very stingy. Being generous is a function of grace, and that grace has been given to every believer. No believer should have business to do with being stingy when it comes to giving. We have received this grace. This grace is in us. This grace is upon us. Every true child of God ought to be generous. Generosity has nothing to do with your financial status. Rather, it has everything to do with the grace of God that is upon your life. If you refuse to be generous when it comes to giving, it is not because you are poor. It is not because you don't have. The Macedonian church is example to every one of us. They were not just in poverty, they were in deep poverty. You can be in deep poverty and still be generous because you have understood grace and you have activated grace. It takes grace to give generously. It doesn't matter your level financially right now. It doesn't matter whether you are wealthy or you are rich. What determines generosity is the understanding of the grace of God. You allowing the grace of God to work in you, through you, and for you. What is grace? Grace is all that God has done in you and will do through you and will do for you. All that God has done. That's what grace is all about. Now, the Bible have already let us know that we have received this grace, and we receive it in full package. There is no grace that you are looking for that is outside you as a child of God. Grace is the nature of God. And if you are born of God, you have His DNA, you have His nature. The nature of God is that of generosity, for God loved the world that He gave. God is a giver. And if you are His child, you ought to be a giver. And let me emphasize it again. Being generous has nothing to do with your financial status. It has everything to do with you understanding the grace of God and activating the grace of God in your life. We have received this grace, and it is the grace of God that makes us to be generous. The grace of God is divine influence upon the heart. Once it comes to giving, the grace of God is already working in our hearts. All we need to do is to work it out. How do we work it out? Is by allowing grace to do His perfect work in us. By yielding to the grace of God. Once it comes to giving, you should not allow people to coerce you, to manipulate you. Allow the grace of God to minister to your heart. And this grace will enable you to give that which ordinarily you could not give or you cannot give. Please, I want you to understand that you have this grace inside of you. It's not outside of you. It's not something we should pray for. It's something we have already. If you look at our text, 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 1, Paul wrote, "We want you to know, brothers, about God's grace that was given to the churches of Macedonia." That was given. Not that will be given. That was given. It is already given. The day you receive Jesus Christ, the grace of giving has been given to you. That grace that will make you to be generous was deposited inside of you. No child of God have business with being stingy. Being stingy is not the nature of God. It's not the nature of those that are born again. And being stingy has nothing to do with your financial status. The reason I cannot give is because I'm poor. It's not true. Look at the Macedonian churches. They were not just poor, they were in deep poverty. Deep poverty. So being generous has nothing to do with your financial status. It has everything to do with you understanding and activating the grace of God that is in your life, that is upon your life, the grace that you have received. How this grace works in your heart is a divine influence. Grace is a divine influence upon the heart and its reflection in life. How do you reflect the grace of God that is in you? Is by being generous. Is by being generous, giving beyond what ordinarily you could give or you think you should give. Giving beyond that. Today, I challenge you. The grace that you have received, activate it by being generous. The grace for generosity is already in you. Allow it to overflow. Allow it to overflow through you to other people around you, through you to the ministry that God have called you. Thank you and God bless you as I come your way next time. Bye-bye.